All right, if you're joining us on YouTube, this is our new YouTube channel. We're populating it rather slowly since this is the first video on it. Behind me is something I'll address in greater detail in just a second. For those of you listening and not watching, it'll become clear as well. But my big head is blocking your view right now. And because I'm such a technical genius, I couldn't quite get the picture right to show you both my giant melon and what's secretly hidden behind me. Well, that's just part of the fun today because this is big guest day on Live from My Office. We'll get to that big news I mentioned. But today on the show, my old friend Richard Roeper reviews his life. Richard Roeper recently left the Chicago Sun-Times, and in this changing media world, what's next? Well, we'll talk about that. He also tells a couple of great Siskel and Ebert stories as well. And ahead of that, I've got a new piece up on Substack. This involves that idiotic signal call that the Trump folks put together. Apparently, the fax machine wasn't plugged in. When they went to this high-level security, I call it Idiotgate, when stupid matters. And I lay it out on Substack. Just search Steve Cochran at substack.com. And like this podcast, I hope you'll subscribe. Speaking of that, if you are watching here on YouTube, thank you. We are going to have tons of video stuff here, including a project with a friend of mine who you know well. I can't say who, but it rhymes with Ana de Volantis. That's coming up in the short-term future as well. Going to be fun. And we're bringing something here that I've been playing around with for a while. It's called Live from My Car, the world's shortest talk show. And if I covered everything, I feel like I'm missing something. Oh, yeah. A brand new podcast from the Live from My Office family. Live from My Office presents, we're not preventing anything, presents 5 things. Some of my funny friends and some of my not so funny friends will join me for a one-on-one where I'll pull 5 random topics. And we are going to try to make sure that none of them are Trump. And every week, these 5 random topics will be batted around in something we call 5 things. I think you're going to enjoy that as well. So a lot happening here in the world of Monkey Run Productions and Live from My Office. So what's the big news? The big news is the merch is in. Let me get out of the way. Maybe this way's better. What you're looking at on YouTube is the Survive 2025 shirt. We've been talking about doing merchandise for a while, and the Survive 2025 shirt. Look, a lot of you met me initially during Fashion Week in Paris. My line of clothing, which didn't take off the way I hoped, was mostly darkly colored sweats. We call it more coach wear, as in head coach. But I love these shirts. This slogan is so fitting for this year because it's not just politics. It's life in general. This has been hard, man. And now we don't have any money. So what do we need to do? We need to do a bit of a pep talk to each other. So you can wear the resistance if you like, or just consider this 100% cotton therapy. Survive 2025 with Live from My Office. These beautiful shirts are available now. The hats will be available in just a couple of days. What hats? Well, I'll show you what hats. Let's see if I can get out of the way far enough here to show you the hats. Here, I'm going to show you the hats. Survive 2025, the cap. That's up there as well, kids. You're going to be able to get them both and order them right now. Get them for your family and your friends. Limited supply. And you can do that at survive2025.us. That's survive2025.us. And I hope you will. All right. So as we continue, what else do I need you to know? Well, I need you to know that Richard Roeper is standing by. So why would we make him wait any longer? Richard Roeper joining me now on Live from My Office. I'm glad you're here. I was just talking to my friend here, Richard Roeper, and he knows I'm a fan and have been forever. He recently left the Sun-Times. We'll get into all of that. But we were talking about the greatest way to end a friendship in show business is to ask someone to be on your podcast.
Yeah, it's very true. But when you ask Steve, I have to go immediately to the cinematic reference of the classic movie Splash. And everybody
Oh,
remembers Splash with the young Tom Hanks and Daryl Hannah, but
sure,
John Candy played the brother. Remember, he was the older brother. And when
sure,
when it
sure.
broke that there was a mermaid, John Candy walked out. There was all this assembled press, and he said, "Anybody here from Penthouse Magazine? Then we ain't talking." So you're my Penthouse Magazine. I'll talk to Cochran. There's a lot
Wow.
of other people. That was my way of saying I will say yes to you, but not to others.
Hold on, it's very sweet. I'm a little misty. All right, let's start with the most recent news.
Mm.
You've decided to move on from the Sun Times. This has got to be like telling your family in the 19th century, I'm moving, I'll be back someday. I hope, or I'll send you a telegram. It's got to be weird. This is your home.
Yeah, Steve, absolutely. I grew up in the south suburbs, and my dad, rode the train to work every day, and he would come home with the Sun Times. We'd read the Sun Times and the old Chicago Daily
Sure.
News. Those were kind of the Tribune's a great newspaper, but where I grew up in Dalton, nobody read the Chicago Tribune. That was for different suburbs or downtown or whatever. So I grew up loving the Sun Times, reading the sports, reading all the columnists, and just thinking, wouldn't it be cool to write for the Sun Times? I never even dreamed of being on the radio or TV. That seemed like some sort of other pipe dream. But writing for the Sun Times, I felt like if I tried really hard and worked hard, that was kind of my natural talent. I would do that. So I started working for, they said I started at the Sun Times in '87, I guess. But that was full time. I started writing for them about 3 years before that, pretty much out of college. So for more than half of my life, editorial assistant, general assignment reporter, news columnist, reviewer. I went through all those iterations. And, you and I both, you've worked at a lot of radio stations, and I've worked at some radio stations and TV stations, but I've just worked at the one newspaper the whole time, Steve. That was the
Amazing.
constant. And yeah, honestly, it is bittersweet. Um, it's very unsettling the first week. I feel like I made the right decision, and I'm looking forward to doing other things. But to not have that, it's a little bit like a Groundhog Day where you repeat. You know this. Everybody. I know
Sure.
this, Steve. People say, I'm sure they say to you, like, I got a radio show in me. And I'm like, everybody has one. What are you going to do Tuesday?
Right,
What's your,
right, right, right.
what's your
Hmm.
what's your Wednesday show going to be? And with the
Sure.
newspaper, in a way, there was almost this comfort level because there was always new material to review. I never really had when I was a columnist, I'd have to say, oh, what am I going to write about tomorrow? But when I'm reviewing radio and television and movies, there's new releases every week. So to jump
Yeah.
off that hamster wheel, I'm still getting my balance, Steve, to tell you the truth.
Well, and that's an interesting thing because this goes to what maybe is your next step, or maybe it's not. What is movies now in regards to reviews and the whole movie going experience? I mean, I remember the first few times I went back into a theater because I like seeing movies in a theater,
Hmm.
after COVID, and it made me sad. I mean, where were kids making out, not paying attention to the movie? And they'd bring out the garbage bag full of pre-made popcorn from the back and give it to you for $47.
Yeah.
It felt like a bad trip to Kmart before they closed things down, and it was AMC. So, what about the movie going experience? Is it ever going to be the same?
I think the good news is because I thought, especially after COVID, I thought that might be it for theatrical release. There'll be specialty, there'll be things like the Music Box in Chicago. There'll be these great old theaters that will show It's a Wonderful Life on holidays and do film festivals. But are we going to have theatrical releases? And it was the same thing for me going back to because I still see a lot of movies in like at AMC or at Landmark a week or two before they come out. You know how it works. They used to give away tickets on a radio show or through Fandango. And I love seeing movies with people. And the first few months back, it was, we were socially distanced. We're wearing face masks. I mean, I felt like it was in a sci-fi futuristic, dystopian thriller. But last summer, Steve, it was this great comeback with the Barbenheimer phenomenon, where
Yeah,
Oppenheimer
true.
and Barbie opened on it was like a magical day, like back in the '70s when you'd have a horror film and a comedy both opening, and they both made well over $1 billion worldwide, and they were critically acclaimed, and that kind of opened the door. And you mentioned AMC. Like I know the one in Streeterville that I go to most often, and this has happened in a lot of other ones. They've renovated all the theaters to get the leather chairs. It's got that new theater smell. So I think they believe that people are coming back. Even something like Wicked to see generational. Like when I went to the screening of Wicked seeing, little girls dressing up as the characters. And if little boys want to do it, God bless America. I'm all for it, but really relating to the characters and loving the story and it becoming this kind of interactive event. So I think that, there's still going to be that, but there's a lot of us who are just like, I'll wait for it on video because it's going to be on video in 3 weeks instead of 6 months.
And the problem in my world with folks waiting for it on video, look, I watch movies on my television, and that's great.
Mhm.
But I also see kids, with a 72-inch TV in their family room, and they're watching movies on their 2-inch cell phone or 3-inch smartphone screen. I don't understand that rewiring of the brain, and it is experiential, and maybe that's the new world that we live in, but it's got to change movie reviews. No one's ever going to question your legacy. You're one of the
Mhm.
all-time greats when it comes to reviews,
Well,
but
thanks.
that's a small club. And what are you
Yeah.
members of that small club? Every chucklehead who wants to do a podcast can do it now. And every chucklehead who thinks they're a movie reviewer can do it now. So what do you do with that reality?
Well, I think that's one of the reasons, honestly, going back, that's why I took the buyout, Steve. I was still doing 7 reviews a week, every single week. And while some of them were making an impact, and you get quoted and you're watching the Super Bowl and they're quoting you by name, but they're also sometimes quoting Joe on Twitter right next to you. Freddie on X says, blew me away, and they're using some of the kids' phrases or something now.
Awesome.
So it all kind of just, it kind of all just kind of becomes this white noise cloud. Rotten Tomatoes is great, but it's also like people don't get that there's top critics where they quote the professionals and then anybody who's a certified tomato critic. And a lot of them, they're great movie fans. Not all of them are great movie critics, and they don't have, I mean, I've written 10,000 reviews. And some of it is studying it, but some of it is also just having the experience to say, okay, I recognize that this director is really influenced by Hitchcock, and it's cool, but
Yeah.
let's not pretend that this is a new shot. And so for me as a reviewer, there were times when I was thinking, I'm going to be one of 250 people that are going to file reviews today, online or in print. I have the fortune to, have the name that can break through on some levels, but I do feel like it's changing quickly. And maybe it was time for me. This was a kind of a nice, gentle push to say I'll do the occasional review, but do I really need to review Fast and Furious 55? Or
Mhm.
even some of the great Marvel movies. There was all this buzz this week about the new Avengers movie, who's in it and who's not. And I'm like, I can't pretend that I was waiting, to find out if whether or not, Star-Lord was going to be in this latest, because I've seen them
Sure.
all, and so,
Sure.
so
Sure.
yeah, I mean, to your point, I think it might have been the time. I don't think they're going to stop reviewing movies in the Sun Times, but I don't think you'll see nearly as many.
A little history for me here. When did
Mm.
you meet Roger and how did that relationship develop?
Yeah.
Roger Ebert, we're talking about.
Yeah, so well, I was at the Sun Times, and of course Roger was at the Sun Times. So, and this goes all the way back to late '80s, early '90s. Even then, Roger was one of the first pioneers of kind of remote working. He'd have a computer set up at his home office. He had an office at the Sun Times, but he wasn't there a lot, and he was on the road a lot, doing the show with Gene. But he was writing. He always got the first computer, whatever the Radio Shack
Didn't know that.
TSR
He was a
80 or
techie.
whatever. Big techie. He was the first one to show. Look at this iPod. You can put all 500 songs in this little thing.
Right.
So I would see him, but he actually was nice enough. He became a fan of the writing I was doing in sometimes pop culture. So once in a while, Roger would say, I can't review this Stephen King horror movie because I'm going to the Cannes Film Festival. Rope should do it. Let Rich do it, and I would start doing reviews. So we became friends socially before we started really working together for probably 15 years. And I actually was, in some ways, knew Gene better, Gene Siskel. I'd go to the screening room because I'd want to write a column about Die Hard or something.
Yeah.
But Gene, as you know, was a huge Bulls fan. He was our Spike
Yeah.
Lee, courtside seats. And Gene also loved to bet on the ponies, and he knew that I was the same guy. So the screening room, for folks who don't know, it's still there. There's a private screening room on Lake Street on the 16th floor of a nondescript building. That's where Roger and Gene would see all their movies, and other critics, Dan Geyer from the Daily Herald, great guy, Michael Wilmington going back, and my friend Michael Phillips
Yeah.
from the Tribune. You'd see Dean Richards there a lot. Nowadays, you see, Jake Hamilton, and it's a legacy. It's still there. But back in the day, Steve, there was an OTB on State Street, an off-track betting facility, right next to the Chicago Theater. So Gene would say to me, there'd be a 10-minute break between movies. Let's go for a walk. Next thing we know, I'm in there, like in The Sting with Gene Siskel, and then Roger he'd come and get us, like, hey, the movies, we're waiting for you guys. Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't know it was 15 minutes.
That's
So
hilarious.
yeah, it's so it's very interesting to me. I got to see those guys, and in fact, here's an anecdote. I don't know if I've ever told Steve, or certainly haven't told in a long time. When Roger and Gene were celebrating their 20th anniversary as TV critics together, they did a piece for Playboy and they were on Letterman, but locally they're like, well, Gene was with the Tribune, Roger's with the Sun Times. Who's going to write the piece? And Gene was the one who said, I want Richard to write it for the Sun Times. I like him better than anybody we have. And I got the
That's
exclusive.
cool.
And that really endeared Gene to his editors. They really enjoyed.
I'll bet they loved it. It's a great story.
Yeah, true story.
And I think about Roger and Gene together, the animosity, the competitiveness, but probably the more correct word, that was real, right?
I saw them. Yes, yeah, absolutely. I mean, they respected each other and they loved each other, but they weren't buddies. They weren't hanging out. And I saw them like again on that Lake Street screening room, 16th floor, as we're waiting for the elevator, arguing about what they were going to get for lunch when they got off the plane at LAX and stopped on the way from the airport to the hotel. You don't know
Sure.
anything. That's the word. Like everything was about a dispute and the taping. And I'm sure folks know this. If you go on YouTube, you can see them when they're taping promos back in the day for the show, and it would take like hours because they would just rip into each other. And there was all this one-upsmanship. And Gene was a much more cynical and calculating guy, and I mean that in a complimentary way. Roger's brilliant. Roger was a genius, but he was from Urbana, Illinois, and Gene had that Yale guy kind of thing, and just a way where Roger could be blunt and very critical, of course, especially of people's work, but he was a sweetheart. And Gene would not
Right.
want you to call him a sweetheart. So he would needle Roger all the time, and he would do these tricks. And there was a time, this was pre 9/11. They would fly together, but they'd never fly next to each other because, of course, people would say, "Look at the two guys." They brought the balcony, so they'd be like 4 seats apart. So they're on the flight to LA, and the flight attendant hands Roger a note. And it says, Mr. Ebert, I'm a huge fan. I'm the pilot of this flight. Once we're up in the air, please come by the cockpit and say hello. Roger's like, ha, ha, ha. I'm so great. And this is back in the day where the door would open. So he goes up there and he knocks on the door and starts opening. The pilot's like, what are you doing? What are you doing? Gene had written the note. It wasn't from the pilot. And they, I would hear these stories from both, and Roger would tell me these stories after, Gene had passed away, and Gene would be like,
George Clooney, Brad Pitt level.
yeah, and Gene would be like, the ego on you that you thought the pilot wanted you to come visit him in the cockpit. The ego on you, like try to turn it around.
Fantastic. Yeah, but the thing when Gene dies, everybody wanted that other chair.
Yeah,
and regardless of the fact that Roger was a fan of yours, and respected you, or certainly knew you, I assume he had pressure to look everywhere.
Yeah.
But the thing I love about your writing is you were able to combine these truly academic references without making me feel stupid or reading them. And you also were smart and hip and funny and younger. Is that what Roger saw in you?
Yeah, it's interesting, Steve, because I obviously, was following as a fan of the show, and Roger was having various guest critics. Sometimes he'd have famous, he'd have film directors, but he had like, the film critic for the Boston Globe and the film critic from this place and that place. So it never occurred to me like I should try out for that because I wasn't a full-time film critic, and we already had a film critic at the Chicago Sun-Times. But what happened was, some of it, sometimes, as it's being there. It's having your foot in the door and it's showing up. So I would get a call from Stuart Cleland, who was the executive producer. And at the time, the show was still at CBS 2 before it went over to ABC 7. And he'd say, hey, somebody was going to fly in and do the show with Roger. They're stuck in the snow at LaGuardia. Can you come in and do this? That's the first time I did it, was like, hey, you want to? So I thought this will be really fun. So I did that. And then a few times they're like, hey, come back next week. And for me, I think everybody else was trying so hard to please Roger that they lost sight of the premise of the show, which was you had to battle with Roger. And I was too naive and also didn't think I was trying out for the job. So I just tore into them for the first time. And then, of course, afterwards, like, that was great. He goes, I'm getting too much of people saying, oh, you're right. You made a good point. I kind of reconsidering what I'm thinking. I'd be like, are you nuts? So that's how it developed. And to Roger's credit and to the credit of people at Disney, they were like, this is kind of weird because he's at the same newspaper. We were thinking maybe we would try something different, or maybe they were even thinking maybe having three critics. But then they were like, this is working the best. Let's do it with this guy. And that's how that happened. So it was a lot of
Well, and
happenstance.
you also were able to be recognized by Leno when he was at his peak at the Tonight Show.
Yeah, that was very
You know,
nice.
Howard Stern.
Yep.
You became pals with Howard, had you
Yep.
on all the time.
Yes.
So you become this Chicago star to this, big deal fairly quickly.
And Roger was Roger by that point. So a lot of times he would be like, he would do obviously he'd go on the Tonight Show or we'd go on Conan, but some of the other stuff he'd be like, I've done this forever. Let Richard do it, which was great
Yeah.
for me. And he also, Roger was a guy who was from a different generation, and even he wasn't even so much a Beatles guy sometimes as he liked classical music and big band music. He kind of grew up on that. So we would. I'm telling all these stories where Roger seems to be the dupe, but he wasn't, because he was one of the smartest people I ever knew, and he was brilliant. But we were at an Oscar party once, pre-party in LA, and Jimmy Kimmel was just starting out as a national guy. He just started doing the Man Show or whatever, and he loved Roger. He worshipped him. He thought he always did, and he was gushing and gushing. And he walked away, and Roger said to me, "What a nice fellow! Is that Wayne Brady?" And I said, "No." I said, because we were going to do Wayne Brady, and he goes, "Well, he looks like a Wayne Brady." And when you think about it, Wayne Brady would, like, and I'm like, "No." I said, "That's Jimmy Kimmel." Okay, all right, got it. And then the next day we're backstage at Wayne Brady, and I was like, "Roger, you see the black guy in every single photo with everybody else behind
Jimmy Kimmel.
Yeah, I go, "That's Jimmy Kimmel." You son of a gun.
Did you ever get a chance to tell Kimmel that story?
I don't know that I ever did. I don't.
Oh my God, he'd love it. He'd love it.
But that was part of the fun too, Steve, was with Roger, spending so much time with him doing those types of things. And he had the greatest stories in the world, because he harkened back to a time where he would spend a week with Lee Marvin for a profile for Esquire magazine. Now, if you get an hour with somebody, it's amazing, unless you're Oprah, you might get it. So, he would have all these stories. So when he and I would travel together, or we'd have lunch, or we were doing promotional stuff, and he never was a name dropper, but I'd be just like, "Okay, tell me about the first time you met Paul Newman." He'd be like, "Oh, he was doing HUD." Or we went to a screening in LA once on one of the studio lots, and we're in the screening room, and he goes, "I saw Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid here when I was 28, in a screening room." I'm like, "Okay." And just a great guy too. We talk about a lot of other things because Roger had such an active mind. I'll give you one more quick name dropping anecdote. We were on the Tonight Show. Michael Moore was on, and this was Michael Moore, just won the Oscar, and was getting into so much. He had death threats. He had like bodyguards with him because he was such a controversial figure, And obviously, people know Michael Moore, very leftist filmmaker. So after the Tonight Show, we go to Musso and Frank, the famous place in Hollywood. If you saw Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, your listeners would know that's where Brad Pitt and Leo meet with Al Pacino. So we're having dinner, and first of all, those guys are world champions when it was going after the menu. Michael Moore and Roger in their prime, and I just sit there and listen to them because Roger was so passionate about politics, and I was just soaking it all in. And Roger's wife Chaz was there, and she and I were just looking at each other. This is so great. And finally, Michael Moore said, "Oh my God, I finally met someone who's to the left of me."
He didn't think it was possible.
Yeah, I didn't know there was any room to the left of Michael Moore.
I don't mean to put you in this position, but I got to ask you to name drop a little bit too. When you're coming up at the Sun Times in the early days, the first profile, because there's a thing called a junket. Yeah. And I think people who are much hipper about media now than they were when we were kids. But a junket is when you line up reporters from everywhere, and you all get your junket time. But the difference between the junket guy and the Richard Roeper guy is the people you're sitting down with generally know who you are. So was there a particular interview or a star where you knew, okay, this is different level now because they knew you and you had to do the legitimate interview with him? Not that you were pals and hanging out, but you became part of that larger Hollywood circle.
Oh, that's a great question. Well, first of all, I like to start off, Steve, I would say a lot of that happened because when I was still kind of coming up, if I said I was from the Chicago Sun-Times, they knew Roger. So they would always be, give my best to Roger, and or Cup, if they were of a different generation, Well,
yeah.
But yeah, There was a moment. I was actually in Kansas City because Paul Newman and his wife Joanne Woodward were making a movie there. I think it was their last movie ever they made together, Mr. and Mrs. Bridge, I want to say it was called. They'd made like
Yeah.
16 films together. But I was there. He had done a movie called Fat Man and Little Boy, which was the nicknames that they had for the nuclear bombs, right? So they were filming it there. So they said, would you go to Kansas City and meet with Paul Newman and talk to him about that movie while he's filming this movie? And I'm like, yes, I will.
Right.
And when he walked in the room, I said, I'm Richard Roeper. And he goes, I know, I'm Paul. And I was like, okay, now I'm through the looking glass, Steve. And that was that moment where I'm like, because, and you know how this goes too. It's exciting to meet, if I meet Timothy Chalamet, that's really cool, but it's the people you grew up watching. So to me, it
100%.
was meeting Jack Lemmon, Paul Newman, Walter Matthau, Shirley MacLaine. That was much more exciting than later on when it would be someone your own age. So that was the moment where it was like, where you, and then the other thing was, when I first got the show, and listen, not everybody thought I was the greatest choice, and hey, it's fair game, right? You know what it's like when someone writes something
Sure.
about you. I don't know. No one ever gave you a bad review, but
No, of course not.
never. But I remember The Simpsons did a joke about me, which was not
Yeah.
particularly nice. And I remember I was on the couch one night, and Letterman kind of ripped into me, and I love Letterman, but I fell off the couch because he was like, "Hey, Paul, have you heard who's this other guy? The other guy." Paul like, "Oh, you know his name," and he goes, "I don't think we need to know his name. He's not going to be around." And I'm just falling off the couch, going, "What is happening right now? This is
Right.
this
Right.
is devastating, but also really great."
Right. Right. I can't believe you're so mean to me. Keep it up.
I mean, it's just, I was like, oh man, it's like I didn't get to the spot where like SNL, I was like, oh, maybe like a Bill Hader will make fun of me one day, but I didn't reach
Right.
that level. That next level, make fun of.
So that could be too. That's a science project, right? To determine exactly when we get to a point where it doesn't matter that 20-year-olds don't get us.
Yeah.
Because there's a sense that humor changes every 5 years, comedy changes every 5 years, and every 5 years is a different take on what's funny. And I can make 20-year-olds laugh in a comedy club, but not as hard as I can make 40 and 50-year-olds laugh.
Common experiences. And I think that's okay too. I don't want to know the names of all the bands at Lollapalooza and pretend like I do.
Right,
That's
right,
fine.
right.
I think that's fine. I think we have to, you don't, I think, and you do a great job of this, Steve. There's a fine line between the old days, the old days, the old days, everything was better, and trying too hard to be, well, my whole routine is going to be TikTok oriented. So
Sure.
you kind of do a little of both. I have a lot of younger nieces and nephews and people that I've mentored, and it does help to be around, people in their 20s and 30s and just say, what is this? Or what do you think of that? Or they'll say to me, hey, you got to check out this new series. You might not have thought it was cool, but it is. But yeah, I get these pitches from publicists from, Peacock and Fuvi and Luvi and Apple TV Plus and, Netflix.
Right.
And I swear to God, this is true. There's one time there were three publicists that I think it was Netflix pitching me something, and they were all named Madison. It's Madison, 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 Madison. But they're always, a lot of them are really good and amazingly, sweet. And usually if they say something like, would you consider reviewing Adolescence on Netflix? If you ever say yes, they always write back, amazing! Exclamation point. It's always amazing.
Right.
But I did have somebody pitch me something recently. Or no, I actually contacted them to get some advanced copies of some series. And the publicist wrote back, amazing. And then she said, would this be for the Chicago Times? And will it
Oh
be
boy.
for an interview or a review? And I'm like, okay, you
Oh
know
boy.
what? She saw my little e-signature and saw some Times thing. And then, I was like,
Yeah.
before I responded, Steve, I looked her up on LinkedIn or something, and she had graduated from Penn State last year. So I'm like, okay, this is a 23-year-old who's got a job as a junior publicist at one of the networks. I'm just going to write back and say, it'll be a review. Don't ever be that guy who says like, didn't you look me up or don't you know who I
Yeah,
am?
exactly.
And I'm like, she was born in 2002. Born.
You can make that up.
You know,
That's a
so
science fiction movie.
like Ocean's 11 and Legally Blonde are her parents' favorite
Yeah.
movie, not even hers. So, and I think, okay, you know what? She'll learn. That's fine. And yeah, you get to a point where you're like, okay, yeah, it's going to be different. Listen, people might not know my name. yeah, sometimes they have to go back to Siskel and Ebert. People don't remember Johnny Carson. I mean, it goes, life
Yeah,
goes
it's
on,
amazing.
you know.
Well, our friend Bill Zemi,
Yeah.
Bill's White Whale was the Carson book that your
Mhm.
colleague and friend of mine, Mike, finally was able to finish.
Yeah. Mike Thomas. Yeah.
And Mike Thomas, and it's a New York Times bestseller, and it should be. But by the time Bill got that book to a point where he thought he could finish it, when he was still sick, it was already people were going, now tell me who Johnny Carson is, which is
Yeah.
incredible to even think about.
Well, and even Bill's form of celebrity journalism, because you could do it and still make it insightful. He was a beautiful writer. I mean,
Yeah.
just a great writer. But
Yeah,
he
one of a
would do
kind.
these profiles, and of course he did books, Letterman and Leno, but these magazine profiles. But you actually felt like you were getting to know those people. Going back to like we were talking about with like Roger, spend a week with Lee Marvin. So Bill would be with Jim Carrey for a month, and then or write books. And now every celebrity that does the book, they just do it themselves. They do the autobiography, and it's fascinating to read Paul Simon's book, but it's not going to be the same book you'd get if some great, writer from the past got into everything with him and Garfunkel. The Gay Taleses and Hunter S. Thompsons and Tom Wolfe's, where that new journalism came out, where they would profile celebrities, but it would go behind the curtain a little bit too. And same thing you mentioned with the interview, Steve. It's like nowadays, if you're interviewing anybody, there's going to be three publicists in the room. There was always some effort at control, but you're not going to be able to ask anything that's even the least bit controversial. And then you have a lot of people who don't really want to know about the film because they just want to get that viral moment. So they try to get, Ariana Grande to sing with them, or
That's why I don't watch ESPN anymore.
yeah,
Everybody wants to come up with the catchphrase. Everybody wants
yeah,
something where they can get their moment.
the cult of personality. I loved the old, ESPN when it was Dan Patrick and
Sure.
and Keith and guys like that. They were so funny as hell and quippy and good, but we got to see them talk about sports. I think
Yeah,
Scott Van Pelt's a guy that still does a great
he's the
job
last
at
guy.
that, and he's
He's the
brilliant.
last guy.
But yeah, I tune
Yeah, it's
in.
kind of the way I felt when I left WLS. And by the way, I left because they fired me, and I always had a plan. I've been fired 11 times, and I always felt like if they fire you, you should leave. It's just
You
me,
know,
but I think that's the way it
you
works.
had that approach. Others have different ones. That
Right,
involve
right.
security and or just doing a George Costanza and just showing up the next week. Was a Larry David thing. Yeah, but God, 11 times. That's
Yeah, it's a lot.
you got to be really good at something to be fired 11 times, and I mean that sincerely because if not,
Well, it's nice of you
you
to say.
well you wouldn't be brought back. You wouldn't be you wouldn't have comebacks. You wouldn't go to the different stations if
Right.
it's sort of like like Roger used to say, it takes a great filmmaker to make something truly awful because anybody else can just make a mediocre movie. So when Francis Ford Coppola makes Megalopolis and it's kind of a disaster, but it's still a fascinating, a big
Sure.
swing.
So let me ask you about the interviewing piece of this too before we run out of time,
Hmm.
because I've interviewed everybody. You've interviewed everybody. There are people that are difficult, and this is a great generality or generalization. The biggest stars in the world, 99% of them are great. It's the people around them that are a pain in the ass.
Yeah, yeah.
They get in the way of the final product. But there are people who I've come across that are pains in the ass and are difficult. Give me your take on Tommy Lee Jones, one of the great actors of all time. We're just talking about the anniversary of The Fugitive. I can't remember if that was on the show or not.
Yeah.
And Tommy Lee Jones, the 3 or 4 times he and I crossed paths, we got to a point after maybe the first interview where I said, I know you're contractually obligated to do these,
Yeah.
but if you just tried to hate him a little less,
Yeah.
what was your experience with him?
I agree. Same thing. And at some point you're like, even if you feel that way, have the respect, first of all, for the people that you work with on the film to promote the film, but
Right.
also the people you're talking to who are just trying to do their jobs. And that kind of that thing where it was just over and over again. And it's interesting because Harrison Ford has kind of in the later stages of his career decided to embrace that. And now he's kind of
Yeah.
fun in these interviews because I think at some point, because he was doing the same thing forever. And De Niro's a terrible interview, but I think it's just because he's more awkward at it. He's trying a little bit. Listen, they're never going to be doing carpool karaoke, these guys. But with Tommy Lee
Right.
Jones, and I can think of a few others, it was like you knew going in they weren't even they yes or no answers to questions about working with a director or did you research the character? Yep. well, come on, man. What are we doing
Yeah, right,
here?
right, right,
But
right.
it's also interesting too. I've had some experiences like now Russell Crowe could be, a difficult guy, but for whatever reason, I've had like amazing experiences. The last time I interviewed Russell Crowe was for the Sun Times, so it was going to be a longer piece, and he said, "Come to my." He was staying at the Peninsula. Come to the penthouse suite. I'll have a publicist. You're not going to go to the junket room. I want to really talk with you. Come on up. And it was really funny because he had this incredible room, of course, and all the windows were open because he's smoking his cigarettes the whole time. Because he doesn't care. But we
Right.
talked for like 2 hours, well beyond the point where I needed anything from him. And he was so gracious. At one point, he's like, I'm so rude. I just got you coffee and water. Let's get something from the menu. And what else do you want to do? Do you want to go for a walk? And I'm like, I'm not going for a walk with Russell Crowe in
See, that's
Michigan.
phenomenal. But
Yeah.
that's okay. But you need to look back on that and pat yourself on the back because nobody at that level, nobody at a CEO level is going to spend 2 hours with you unless they like you as a guy,
Yeah.
unless they want to connect with you as a guy.
No, those were the moments when I look back at all of this stuff, Steve, the TV show stuff and all that was great, but it's sort of like those moments where you go, I mean, we lost Gene Hackman of just a while back, and uh, I hadn't spent that much time with him, but maybe an hour in Las Vegas because Postcards from the Edge was the movie, which had
Oh, yeah.
which had all these stars in it, Dennis Quaid and Meryl Streep and Shirley MacLaine. And the junket again, it was in Las Vegas because Shirley MacLaine was doing a show, a one-person show, and Gene Hackman. We had this great conversation. He was another guy that could be, pretty gruff, pretty,
Sure.
by the books. Danville joined the Marines when he was a teenager, but he was actually pretty great. And what again, a big guy, like 6'2", 6'3",
Yep.
larger than life. But that was another one of those moments where I'm like, I remember seeing you, in Bonnie and Clyde on,
Yeah.
the probably not in the theaters because it was before my time, but probably on the Channel 9 News with it edited that I didn't know was edited, and the conversation and everything else he did. And those are
What
the
about Young
moments.
Frankenstein? One of the first things I ever saw Gene Hackman do was Young Frankenstein. And I thought, wow, that weird guy, he's really funny. And he turns out to be Gene Hackman.
Yeah,
And he
incredible.
came in to WGN in the early 2000s. He was writing books,
Yes, yeah.
and he came in to promote one of the books. And we had only crossed paths a couple of times. But he came in and he was going to do the tough guy Gene Hackman thing. Here's the book, buy the book. But when I brought up Young Frankenstein, he just lit up.
See, that's the thing
Um,
too. And that's what makes you so good because you found that thing where it's like you're not going to say the same three things to him that everybody did, Unforgiven or whatever.
so, is there a Gene Hackman that's working now? I mean, who are the young actors now? You mentioned Timothy Chalamet. Kid's incredibly talented. Nobody's going to give him the big Western tough guy part.
Mm.
But is there the Gene Hackmans, Robert De Niro's? Are they out there now?
I don't know if they're in, and if they are in their 20s, we don't know yet. But when you
Yep,
look at some of the guys who are in their 40s and 50s, DiCaprio and Brad Pitt, they've carved out those types of careers where they're like,
that's true.
and even, it's interesting because George Clooney now he's got this play on Broadway, right? Based on Good Night and Good Luck. And he did a recent interview. He said, hey, I'm 60, whatever. I'm not going to do leading man roles. But when you look back, he really didn't do that many romantic comedies. He was, always the Ocean's movies had that kind of touch, but he only really did a few standard rom-coms. He was too busy saying, I can get Michael Clayton made. I'll do this big Ocean's movie
Yeah,
so I can get Michael Clayton made. Or Syriana, these serious films. And Brad Pitt is the same way. And some of these guys, I think they had to wait till they're still incredibly good looking, but they had to get to a certain point where they're like, okay, I can do other things and people can take me seriously. So I don't know. It's hard to, it's just a different, as you mentioned, it's different now because it used to be you were in movies or TV, and they were considered, one was considered far superior to the other. And then when you get to a certain age, at the end of your career, Jimmy Stewart had a TV show. Lucille Ball, people think of her as her TV star, but she had done movies. Henry Fonda had, the Smith family, I think it was. They would do these series where you'd be like, oh man,
right.
But now, no, Nicole Kidman does TV, then she does a movie, then she, and even the younger actors, because the television quality, the series quality is so good. But I think that does make the stars not diminish, but not larger than life. Nicholson was Nicholson. He almost never even did like TV talk shows because he wanted to be a movie star. You saw him at the
Right.
movies and you saw him at the Oscars, and the rest of it you didn't need to know about. That era, Steve, I do think is gone.
And almost by necessity too, to some extent, because I think you probably have publicists now would be pushing these guys and agents pushing these guys out there to talk about everything all the time.
Even somebody younger like Scarlett Johansson, she's in the next Jurassic Park iteration. And she's, Scarlett's been acting since she was like 9 years old. She was in The Horse Whisperer.
Right.
She was in like one of the, was it Home Alone? One of those like sequels, like way back when as a
Well,
kid.
and
But
you mentioned Conan and Letterman. She was on Conan and Letterman as a little girl.
yeah, so she's had this long career already, and brilliant work. But she's a private person. I mean, I think people know by now she's married to Colin Jost, and they have a couple of kids, but they don't do that. And she's not on social media. And she said, even in doing Jurassic Park, they're like, you get immediately have 8 million followers, and she's just like, I don't want to do that. I don't want to post everything I'm doing. I don't want to share my thoughts.
Sure.
She's to a level where she can do that. But if you're 25 right now, you have to be on social media if you want to be a
Right.
musician or any and it's part. Well, listen, you know that it's like I remember right when Twitter and Facebook started coming out, and I was doing various and they're like, "Hey, you didn't update your Facebook page today." I'm like, "Well, I'm spending 4 hours on this radio show here."
Right. Right. Wait, you were always great on the radio too. I hope you
Well,
enjoyed all
thanks.
this, all those. I mean, and I'm not just talking about with Roe, and we both love Roe, but your solo shows are great too.
Well, thank you. I will tell you this. I know I've been very lucky because I've had a lot of great partners that I've worked with. Obviously Roger and with Ro, but the times I did solo stuff is when I really, and Rob Feeder, our old friend, the greatest media
Yep.
reporter Chicago's ever had, he will tell you this, that I would gush to him about how great you are because you always had good people around you, but I said, I never could do that. I was much better playing off somebody either as an equal or I was happy to be the sidekick. And what you do, and we were lucky enough in Chicago, there were probably I still think the greatest radio city ever because
100%.
Steve Dahl had Gary, but Steve Dahl was Steve Dahl, and
Well, that was
Brandmeyer,
Dahl's show.
you
That was
know,
Dahl's show. There's no
and
question.
and Steve Cochran and Kevin Matthews. I mean,
Yep.
and going back before that, Larry Lujak,
Yep.
Bob Surratt. These names of when I and in some cases, listen, they were doing music and a couple of bits here and there, but when it got into the talk era, what you do day in and day out and did for so long, I could not do that.
Yeah. Well, it's I share your melancholy when it comes to the end of radio, to what's happened to the standard newspapers,
Hmm.
because people always go, well, it's just a different platform. It's just a different way to deliver the content, but they don't understand that shift creates a whole different way to work
Hmm.
and changes everybody's trajectory. And I don't know about you, but at 64, for me, the idea of starting over is a little tedious.
It is. And, listen, you and I both do a lot of this kind of stuff. It's really cool. We can do stuff from home. Uh, and for a long time, in the last, decade or so, I was doing most of my newspaper work from home or on the road. But there's nothing that can beat the excitement of going into a radio station when it was hitting on all cylinders and, the sales staff was buzzing and there were support staff and even the kitchen people would be in there talking, oh, and this guest is coming in.
Showbiz.
And the same thing when I was going into the Sun Times back in the 90s, it looked just like it does in the news, in the movies about newspaper, big newsroom meeting behind glass, and then some editor's going to screaming match with the political reporter, but then the sports guy comes running in and says, "I heard Jordan's on retiring." You felt like you were
Right.
literally in Stop the Presses. We were lucky enough at our ages, we're the same age, to be. I think the last generation that got to do that.
Sure.
Nobody's ever going to work. The 10 years we've had. And when I started, some of the reporters at the Sun Times had been around since the 60s. So they could tell stories about the Democratic Convention and Watergate and,
Sure.
the moon landing. And so it was like, what? And that you lose that when we're all separated too. If the newsroom
Yeah.
is a virtual newsroom, if the radio station is, well, this person's remote and that person's remote, I think you do lose something.
Yeah. And it does water the content down.
Yeah.
Having said that, we both have very bright futures as youngsters. And I couldn't be a bigger fan of
Well,
yours
thank you. Thank you. I feel the same
and
way. You
always
know that.
have been. And you got to keep writing. You got to keep writing. We
I
need it.
will.
And by the way, we should mention TV as well because you have a lot of fun with the guys on Channel 7 every Friday, right?
Yeah, and that's again, that because ABC 7 is number 1, so it's I love going over there. During COVID, I would go on and do the remote thing, but even though I'm only on usually once a week, once in a while a little bit more, you go in there and it still has that buzz of a top-rated TV station. The news people are over there, and the afternoon people are coming in, and the crew. They're so nice, and they're like, "Hey, we got jobs, and they're doing very
Right, right,
well.
right.
But I go over there; it's like the biggest hour buzz of my week. Is you walk in and you got that sign there saying a live television program is in progress. Please turn
Right,
off your phone, and you're like, "This is cool." So I
right.
still love doing that. Yeah,
With real human beings, which is a little tough to assemble. Tell people
people.
about your podcast too.
Podcast is really simple. It's called. I came up with this name, Steve. I should have run it by you, but I call it the Richard Roeper Show.
All right, hold on, let me write that down.
Yeah,
The Richard Roeper Show.
and
Okay,
I always tell
good
people,
call, I think.
and it's I always tell people, where can I get it? I go, just Google it. It's on the Spot Apple Odyssey thing. It's sometimes I'm like, I didn't even know I was on the Amazon thingy. Where's my money?
Right,
But yeah, it's just
right, right, right.
and you and I talked a little bit before we went on. It's just me. Once in a while, I have a guest. I can't get a Cochran because he's too busy doing his thing.
Oh yeah, way too busy.
Uh,
Sure.
but it's just honestly, I'm just kind of offering thoughts on what's happening in the world of pop culture and doing reviews. It's a great place to do reviews because I can, with the newspaper, you write 800 words. On Channel 7, you get 6 minutes to go through it. On the podcast, I can do a little bit more of what you and I are doing now and tell an anecdote about an actor or talk about how this is a spin-off of something else or reminds me of that. That's the most fun I have is kind of putting some context into some of these reviews, saying, listen,
And I think I saw this in the Axios interview that
mm,
one of the guys over there did. Maybe it was Justin.
yeah, it was
But
Justin. Justin.
16,000 bylines.
Yes. I think the last one
I mean,
was
I've done about 11,000 radio shows, and I thought, wow, that's impressive. 16,000 times.
I looked because they have a great database there, so I could, and the great thing is I could go back and see what I said about something, wrote about something. I don't know if I don't think I
Yeah.
have access to that anymore now that I.
Oh yeah. Okay.
I'm going to try password 123. I gave it to the guys over at that Signal chat, and they've been abusing it all week. But yeah, that kind of and of course that includes everything, going back to news stories and columns and stuff. About 10,000 reviews, and I'm like, maybe it was time to start thinking about doing. That's a little obnoxious, quite frankly. How much do we need to hear from one
Listen,
guy?
and I mean this with all sincerity, and I don't say this about a lot of people. I never read one of your columns where I didn't finish it. Now,
Thank
to
you.
me,
Thanks.
that's a compliment to a
Yep.
writer. Because in
Absolutely.
the AD, and it's with my ADD in particular, but in the
Yeah.
ADD era we live in, people barely get past the headline. It's part of the reason we're in this situation.
Well, I really appreciate that, Steve. And the truth is, I shortened the length of most of my reviews from 12 or 1300 words to 800 and sometimes 500, knowing that I was competing with somebody who had it on a tablet while they were doing three other things. So,
Yeah.
in some ways it was daunting. In some ways it strengthened my work as a writer because I'm like, you were repeating yourself a couple of times. You got to the point here, you told people what you thought about the movie. Get out.
Interesting. And by the way, I hope you've noticed we're not too old to learn. The most important question I could probably ask you before I let you go: the White Sox general manager, Chris Getz, and you're a lifetime White Sox guy.
Mhm.
Chris Getz seems like a nice fella.
Seems
Seems like
like
a
it.
very nice fella.
Mm.
And a lot of positive hope for him there
Mhm.
and for the White Sox. But as a fellow White Sox fan,
Mm.
when I hear Chris Getz say we're going to win more than we won last year, I don't know that that's a call to the Southside.
I looked at tickets for some of the early games, and you could go see the White Sox and maybe get a nice giveaway like a plush blanket for less than it would cost you to see Snow White at this point at the AMC theaters. And I'm with you. I think what did they win? 40 something last year, and
41 games.
and people are saying, oh, they'll win 55 because and I'm like, I don't see that this lineup is better than last year's. There's no Garrett Crochet to start, just right off of the bat, So, and literally off the bat, I'm looking at the lineup and I go, never heard of him, never heard of him. Know him, not too good, but I know who he is. So, it is almost like we're in a different universe than if you're a fan of the Dodgers, for example. And
Oh my God.
I saw an article.
Absolutely, two different worlds.
I mean, when it is, and I think it's a problem for baseball on a larger level with the haves and have-nots. But The White Sox are going, I believe they're going to Los Angeles for a 3-game set this year, Steve. And I saw an article in one of the sports publications this week that said that will be the largest favorite in a single game of baseball since they started taking betting. They'll be like the Dodgers will be like a 9-1 favorite, which never happens in baseball because everybody wins games once in a while. And I'm like, oh,
Right.
this is not
MLB
good.
will bring up the slaughter rule.
They, just 6 innings maybe would be just good. Let's just, before the kids they can go home then. So I wish I could say I don't see anything changing for quite a long time. That's the other thing. I see other teams bouncing back, or you see teams in like Kansas City Royals in much smaller markets, and they can build a pretty good, Cleveland. They do these turnarounds, and we just have, I don't know. It's a lovely location,
Tough.
and they have great snacks. Great. They're always in the top
And
5.
I've never had patience for people who slam the stadium. The stadium is just fine and
Yeah.
rather enjoyable, francely.
Yeah.
And you don't have parking problems. And I hope if you're a White Sox fan, you do go out and see a few games this year. Do it for Richard and do
Yeah.
it for me.
I agree.
And for the great White Sox of the past. But just know that in the spring of 2025, prior to opening day, the team slogan shouldn't be wait till 2027.
Not good. I think they were eliminated this
Not
week
great.
they're
we're
mathematically eliminated. Magic number.
All right, best way to follow you with all the things that Richard Roeper is going to do from here. What do we do?
Great. Thanks for asking that, Steve. I'm still doing the Twitter, which now we call the X, but the Richard E. Roeper on Twitter, I find is still the best way, even with all its, whatever baggage comes with it. It's the best way for me to tell people, hey, here's where I'm going to be. Here's what I'm up to. So Richard E. Roeper is the X handle.
All right. And the podcast and Fridays on ABC7. They changed the title of the show now, didn't they?
It's Windy City Weekend because it's on once a week,
okay.
even though it should be, who knows what might happen there. Maybe it'll be Windy City bi-weekly, although I never knew if that meant twice a week or every other week. So
no, that's a class I skipped too. It's great talking to you, my friend. And
anytime, Steve. Thank you.
I think you made the right choice. And I just look forward to what's next.
Thank you so much, my friend.
Well, there you go. I have no doubt Mr. Roeper is going to be in our lives for as long as he wants. But it was great catching up with him. In the meantime, and by the way, he'll be one of my guests on 5 Things, the highly creative title of a new podcast coming soon from the Live from My Office family. I want to thank Ross Cochran, of course, for producing all of this. And don't forget to get your Survive 2025 shirts. Live from my office. It's very simple. You just go to survive2025.us and get them before they're gone as we build a merch library as well. My fashion empire, it's really starting to take shape. Oh, and the caps? Oh, yeah. Can you see the those look good. Those look good. The Survive 2025 caps available as well. Survive2025.us. Remember, it's not a fight. It's not an argument. It is 100% cotton therapy and an opportunity for you to wear your resistance. Thanks for listening, as always. As I mentioned, thanks to Ross. Don't forget about our Substack, substack.com. Just search Steve Cochran. And please tell your friends. We got such good stuff coming to Live from My Office. This is not just another podcast. Well, it is another podcast, but this one actually doesn't suck. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time. Thank you, Richard Roeper. This is Live from My Office.